A city named after a blue flower, once the center of wealth in the southern coalfields in a $37 million tunnel. I'm Wayne Worth, and you're watching On the Road in West Virginia, our 55 counties, Mercer County. Long before tunnels, railroads, and interstates, there were rivers, and those rivers attracted 18th century settlement to what we today call Mercer County. It also brought Native American raiding parties who were trying to sustain a way of life in Western Virginia free of white settlement and expansion. Unfortunately, sometimes it even got bloody, as early pioneer Mitchell Clay and his family found out after establishing a settlement near the Shawnee Lake area. Story has it that Mitch went hunting for game while his two boys Ezekiel and Bartley built a fence for their stacks of grain. Shortly after, a small raiding party killed both Bartley and Mitchell's daughter Tabitha and took their scalps, and also kidnapped Ezekiel, who was later burned at the stake. Now, after tensions settled between the white settlers and Native Americans, Mercer County would be a relatively quiet and isolated region during the early to mid-1800s. However, this all changed drastically during the Civil War. Mercer County, like many counties that bordered Virginia, were pro-Confederacy. And though the county was not a hotbed for a lot of action during the war, mainly due to its isolation and rugged mountains, it did manage to host the 1862 Battle of Pigeon Roost. To make a long and complicated story short, in April of 1862, a skirmish took place around Camp Creek as Union forces drove Confederate forces south into Princeton. The next day, the retreating Confederate forces decided to burn the town to the ground. Fast forward a couple of weeks later, the Union forces were getting their butts kicked in Pearisburg, Virginia, and when they hightailed it west of Princeton, they ran into the 51st Virginia Infantry. What ensued was 2 days of fighting, with the Confederates having the advantage of occupying a ridge on the outskirts of town called Pigeon Roost. During the second evening of the battle, the Union forces were ambushed and suffered over 50 casualties. Believe it or not, the battle came to somewhat of a mysterious end when both armies again were ready to go head-on at each other, but decided to part and go their separate ways. Post-Civil War, Mercer County would bring significant changes to the region economically, as two major railroads and a little black rock would turn this once isolated region into a major center of wealth and power. The discovery of what would be one of the most productive coal seams in the nation, or as we know it, the Pocahontas No. 3 coal seam, would be the start of West Virginia's coal rush. It first started during the 1880s with the Pocahontas Land Corporation buying much of the land in the region that possessed these rich coal deposits. What came next was the railroad. The N&W Railroad decided to build their Pocahontas Division headquarters and terminal in a meadow of all places at the headwaters of the Bluestone and East Rivers, which today we call Bluefield. Now, one would ask, why was the place named Bluefield? Well, if you guessed it was named after an industrialist or a coal baron, then you guessed wrong. It was really named after a blue flower, or the proper term, azure chicory, that were grown on a nearby ridge. Of course, Bluefield would rapidly become an economic center in the southern coal fields as the population went from around 1,800 in 1890 to over 11,000 by 1910. With thousands of African American workers moving to Mercer County to staff the mining and railroad jobs, Bluefield also became one of the cultural centers in our state. In 1895, the legislature even created the Bluefield Colored Institute, which is today Bluefield State College, to provide a path to higher education for African Americans in West Virginia. In 60 years, Bluefield would go from being a large meadow in the middle of nowhere to having a major railroad, large wholesale warehouses, and even a 12-story hotel. However, the boom in coal didn't stop there, as wealth and prosperity during the first half of the 20th century continued to spread throughout the county. Princeton, which was and still is today the county seat for the first 10 to 15 years after the great coal boom, had to sit on the sidelines and watch Bluefield grow into an economic powerhouse as they struggled to hold on to being the center of county government. That all changed, though, in the early 1900s with the coming of the Virginian Railway, as Princeton was now connected to bigger markets. As a result, the population doubled from around 3,000 in 1910 to over 6,000 by 1920. Now the N&W and Virginian Railway would open many communities up to the economic opportunities and benefits that the early coal industry provided. Then the 1950s and 60s came as the industry invested heavily in mechanization when mining coal. Of course, this was the beginning of a tough transition, as Bluefield in 50 years had a population decrease of over 10,000. What is interesting, though, is that the county's population has only decreased by around 15,000 during the past 65 years, and even had an increase of 10,000 residents during the 1970s. So I know you're asking, how with the steady decline in the coal industry does Mercer County survive economically? One answer, Interstate 77. What was once the West Virginia Turnpike, built between 1952 and 1954, started off as a two-lane highway that ran from Princeton to Charleston. A couple of decades later, and more funding, construction on upgrading the two-lane West Virginia Turnpike to the four-lane that we have today began. However, what really transformed the region was the building of the East River Mountain Tunnel in 1974, which connected West Virginia with Virginia and came with a $37 million price tag, deeming it the biggest expense ever for the West Virginia Department of Highways. Upgrading the West Virginia Turnpike, which is today mostly I-77, was a significant game changer not only to southern West Virginia, but to Mercer County. As a result, the county is now connected with major cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, Cleveland, Ohio, and all points in between. Now, education has also been a centerpiece that has provided vitality to both the county and the region. What derived from the community of Athens, West Virginia, losing out to Princeton for the county seat after the Civil War was the birth of what we today call Concord University. The group of disappointed Athens residents said, heck, if we can't be the county seat, we at least better get a school, and that they did in 1872. Though back then it was just a state normal school, today it's a state university with an enrollment of around 2,500 students. And on the subject of education, we cannot forget that Bluefield was the birthplace of John Nash, who is a world-known mathematician whose contributions to mathematical theories are still widely used today in modern-day economics. Hollywood even made a movie about his life titled A Beautiful Mind. And finally, we also can't forget about the county's investment in heritage tourism. Now, southern West Virginia and Mercer County has a very unique story that needs to be told, and the Coal Heritage Trail does just that. The Coal Heritage Trail, managed by the Coal Heritage Authority, worked to preserve, interpret, and promote the rich coal heritage in southern West Virginia. Through building public-private partnerships, efforts are made to not only restore historical sites, but to also help revitalize old coal communities through promoting their rich history home and abroad. Which takes us back here to Bluefield, once a center of wealth in our southern coal fields, and today known as nature's air-conditioned city, where the city gives out free lemonade if the temperature exceeds 90 degrees. It ain't 90 degrees, but man, that was refreshing. I'm Wayne Worth, and until next time, always remember, what we value and hold important to our lives today came from events that happened yesterday, and it's when we begin to understand the events of yesterday that we fully embrace today, which makes tomorrow become less of a mystery.